Good evening, everybody, and welcome into another program with the Schaumburg Township District Library. This is another session in our series, Night with the Museum, featuring some of the wonderful cultural institutions across our wonderful country. Tonight, we are being joined by the National First Ladies Museum or Library and Museum. Sorry, I want to make sure I put those in the correct order. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, just a few friendly reminders to those at home. Your cameras and microphones have been turned off, but if you're experiencing any technical difficulties and need to reach out, you can feel free to do that using the Q&A in the bottom of your screen. That way I can go directly back and forth with you. If there's any issues, I'll be able to reach out that way. You'll notice that closed captions have been enabled. And of course, if you have any questions for our presenter, you can also throw those in the Q&A. We can take the questions in the Q&A throughout the program, but we won't read them and engage with them until the end of the program. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate, throw them in there right away. And that way you can not have to worry about remembering them at the end. Another thing, if anyone's experiencing any issues with Zoom and we're not able to get them fixed, we are live streaming this presentation on the Schaumburg Library YouTube page. So you can go and type into YouTube Schaumburg Library and find the active live stream of this, if that's an easier way for you to view the program if something happens throughout the course of it, just so you know that that's an option for you as well. Now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce this evening's speaker, Stephanie Bonack. Stephanie is the Director of Education and Cultural Services for the National First Ladies Library and Museum. With an MA in History and Public History from Bowling Green State University, specializing in women's history and American enslavement, Bonack is dedicated to illuminating often overlooked narratives in American history. Stephanie leads educational programming and outreach while assisting in collections management and curation, ensuring exhibits are both engaging and historically accurate. Through innovative programming and research, exhibits, and outreach, Stephanie Bonack honors the legacies of America's first ladies while fostering historical literacy and inclusivity for all. Ladies and gentlemen, you can see she's just popped up on your screen. A big virtual round of applause for Stephanie Bonack.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. And thank you for having me this evening. This is actually one of the later programs that I've done, so I hope you'll excuse my attire and the fact that I am in my home office, as it is 8 p.m. here in good old Northeast Ohio. Gosh, I'm so sorry. And you probably just heard my cat as well. So let me close my door really quick. I apologize. I didn't think they'd start yowling. But of course, if any of you have cats, you know that they love to do that right when you get on the phone. Give me 2 seconds. I apologize. Thanks, all. I don't know if anyone else has furry friends, but they really do love to do that, don't they? So I'm going to stay on this slide just for a minute. I'd like to get us kind of in the mode. Please feel free, as was said, feel free to throw some questions in the chat, in the Q&A especially, and I'd be happy to get those at the end of my program. Just to set the scene here a little bit, tonight I'm going to be talking about Gilded Age gals, first ladies who served from 1877 to 1900. When First Lady Lucy Hayes arrived in Washington, D.C. on a cold March morning in 1877, she exuded grace and resilience despite her husband's contested election. The election of 1876 not only ended Reconstruction, but also ushered in the Gilded Age, an era defined by corruption, rapid immigration, and stark social divides. Though often romanticized in literature and film, this period was sometimes glamorous only for the elite. For those in the working class, life was often marked by labor strikes, wage disparity, and unsafe conditions, while industrial titans amassed staggering wealth and politicians profited from backroom deals. Yet amid these struggles, movements for women's rights, temperance, and racial progress gained momentum. Within this shifting landscape, First Ladies played a vital role. Some, like Frances Cleveland and Ellen Arthur, reflected the era's social norms, while others, Lucy Hayes, Lucretia Garfield, Caroline Harrison, and Ida McKinley, took on causes personally to alleviate suffering, all of them leaving a lasting impact on American history. As was said, I am from the National First Ladies Library Museum, which is actually operating within the First Ladies National Historic Site. So we are the nonprofit partner to the National Park Service. So It is the only institution in the world dedicated to First Lady's history. That's what makes it so unique. There is no other site in the world that encompasses every single First Lady's legacy. Yes, sometimes a presidential library will have a room or even a few panels in their exhibit dedicated to the First Lady, but we have the research, we have the resources, and we have a wonderful 5,000 object collection. Some of the items which you'll see in this presentation this evening that help share the lives and legacies of our nation's First Ladies. Through our exhibits, research, and public programs, we further explore these lasting impacts that they've had on politics, society, and even pop culture, both in the White House and beyond their time in their term. Coined by Mark Twain as early as 1873, the Gilded Age described an era where corruption and greed were often masked by a thin layer or a veneer of wealth and progress. Following the Civil War and Reconstruction, the United States underwent rapid industrialization, urban expansion, and mass migration of peoples. However, these advancements often came at a cost, as they do in many eras. Severe economic inequality, political corruption, and the exploitation of laborers were often the result. The Panic of 1873 triggered a deep economic recession, leading companies to slash wages, specifically in railroad and steel industries. This economic strain led to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the first major nationwide labor uprising, setting the stage for future industrial conflicts. Struggles between workers and industry leaders escalated, culminating in violent clashes like that of the Homestead Strike in 1892. Despite these hardships, the Gilded Age is still regarded as a pivotal moment in shaping America's role on the world stage, influencing the nation's ever-evolving democracy, its political structures, and social movements that would carry on into the next century. As industrial capitalism flourished, social notions such as social Darwinism emerged as a justification for economic inequality, often arguing that wealth and power were the natural reward for the most fit of individuals. This belief reinforced a political and economic system where industrial magnates wielded significant influence over lawmakers, often securing policies that protected their personal and business interests. Meanwhile, workers, as I said, faced poor conditions and low wages, and as a result began forming unions to demand better treatment within the workplace. Though these early labor movements were disorganized and lacked legal protection, they did lay the foundation for future workers' rights advancements. Beyond labor issues, the era also saw growing calls for social reform. Middle-class activists championed causes like temperance, women's suffrage, and even racial equality, although often some of these came with a paternalistic mindset that framed these marginalized groups as needing guidance and almost a parental figure rather than just equal rights. This belief extended beyond domestic issues, even influencing U.S. foreign policy abroad. Justified as a civilizing mission, American expansionism led to the subjugation often of indigenous peoples within these newly acquired territories, reinforcing what would be determined as imperialistic ideals, shaping the nation's global role for decades to come. That being said, amid all of this, I'd just like to provide an introduction because the Gilded Age is such an interesting and fascinating time period. You're like, well, what do first ladies have to do with that, other than the fact that they served? But it's during the Gilded Age that these industries are booming. You have this huge urbanization and metropolitan rising, and those social movements took shape, and first ladies were not exempt from participating in those. While men like Rockefeller and Carnegie continued to build their fortunes, first ladies themselves, actually, as women too, found their own ways to influence the nation through their reforms, sometimes through tradition, and even through quiet leadership. And just as a note, I will be going in chronological order, so we'll be starting with the First Lady of the Gilded Age, Lucy Webb Hayes. Born in Chillicothe, Ohio, as the youngest of 3 children in a family with a complex legacy regarding enslavement, Lucy Webb Hayes is a very fascinating First Lady. Her father, in fact, Dr. James Webb, actually sought to break with that legacy of enslavement by working to emancipate those he had inherited. Unfortunately, he tragically contracted cholera during his trip to Kentucky to fulfill this mission and passed away when Lucy, as we call her, was just 2 years old. Left in the care of her mother, Maria Cook, Miss Webb demonstrated resilience and promise from an early age. Despite the societal limitations placed on the women of her time, she herself received an exceptional education. She attended the Chillicothe Female School and later enrolled at Ohio Wesleyan University, where she studied alongside her brothers, breaking barriers for women in education. Influenced by her grandfather's values, we know that Lucy Webb developed a strong commitment to temperance, which later would earn her the nickname Lemonade Lucy following her time as First Lady of the United States. In 1850, she graduated from the Cincinnati Wesleyan Female College, making her the first First Lady in American history to earn a college degree. Her writings and beliefs while as a student reflected her commitment to gender equality and social reform, and she actively engaged in the early movings of the women's rights movement. She even once wrote, and this is a direct quote, "Instead of being considered the slave of man, she is considered his equal in all things and his superior in some." Although her marriage to Rutherford B. Hayes in 1852 shifted her focus towards familial responsibilities and homemaking, she did remain dedicated to advocating for equal rights and the need for social change. Following her marriage to Rutherford B. Hayes, Lucy Hayes devoted herself to family while also championing those values of equality and social justice. Her strong moral opposition to enslavement deeply influenced her husband and the family, who continued to maintain abolitionist principles throughout the rest of their lives. It is believed that she even took an active role in teaching their free Black servant, Eliza Jane, to read and write, reflecting her commitment to education and empowerment for all. During the Civil War, Lucy Hayes gained the affectionate nickname Mother Lucy due to her unwavering support for Union soldiers serving in the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry under her husband. She often visited her spouse in the field, providing emotional and practical support, even in the face of significant personal risk. In fact, tragically, during many of these visits, 2 of their children passed away due to the unsafe and unsanitary conditions within the military camps. As a compassionate and dedicated advocate, Lucy Hayes ministered to wounded soldiers, she offered medical assistance, and even mended uniforms, bringing her sewing machine all the way with her to wherever the camps were located. Her commitment to supporting veterans continued as First Lady of Ohio, where she established an orphanage for children of Civil War veterans, which would then become her primary cause. At the White House, her warm hospitality and commitment to her causes earned her widespread popularity and respect. Despite a less than warm welcome in D.C. following that 1876 election, she became the most widely known and popular president's wife the country had known. She actively supported charities in Washington, promoted her former initiatives, and even sponsored scholarships for students of color at the National Deaf-Mute College. After serving as First Lady, Lucy Hayes returned to her home, the family home, in Spiegel Grove in Fremont, Ohio, where she lived until her passing in 1889 at the age of 57 years old. Now, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I have added some objects to this presentation because I find that a lot of people are so moved by what we actually have in our collection. And I am pleased to report that as of this year, we have 95 authentic First Lady gowns, as far as we know. And so what you're seeing here is a few examples of things for each First Lady, if I have them, in recognition of what we have in our archives, as well as being able to show off some of the fashion. That's one of the main things people care about, I feel, when you talk about the Gilded Age. It's labor strikes, and what does fashion look like, and how does it ebb and flow throughout the era? And as seen in fashion today, First Ladies are criticized for what they wear or what they don't even sometimes, or what designers they use. And that should be understood. That crosses several generations of First Ladydom. So, as I said, one of the pinnacles of the Gilded Age, alongside art, culture, and industry, was this fascination and this burgeoning fashion movement itself. Although Lucy Webb Hayes dressed somewhat modestly, her clothes still highlight early aspects of Gilded Age fashion that are typical of the era. So, starting at the top right, we have a Lucy Hayes 2-piece maroon silk gown with velvet and black lace asymmetrical designs. The cloak is black velvet with black jet beading and a velvet fringe, and we know this is from the early 1870s. In the top left, you'll see Lucy Hayes's mother of pearl hand-shaped brooch with a cuff. There is gold around the wrist and the cuff itself, and we know that, as you can probably see, the pointer finger unfortunately has broken off. Now, another unfortunate, we don't actually know the date that this pin was designed or made or even worn, but we can speculate she probably wore it at some point being First Lady of Ohio and then in the White House as First Lady of the United States. In the center, we have a beautiful Lucy Hayes black bonnet with coral flowers, red and green plumes, and a black silk bow with ribbon. And we know this is actually from the 1880s. On the bottom left, we have another brooch of hers. This one is an oval brooch with a soldier wearing a helmet on a black background in a center with a rosette on each side. Very similar to the mother of pearl brooch. We don't know exactly what year she may have worn this. And finally, kind of in that bottom center, that beautiful brown dress, which I know brown is not the most popular color to wear now, but at a time it was. It is a two-piece dark brown silk afternoon dress with a brocade design and 16 buttons. And yes, they're not like our buttons where they're fake. They would have had to button every single one of them. The bodice sleeves themselves have ribbon bows if you look closely. And we know that this was worn in the White House in the late 1870s. Just as another kind of note of fashion in the era, brown and black were very popular in this era in dark colors because at the time with urbanization, you still have some streets that are not quite yet brick or paved. So if she's walking in her afternoon dress in downtown Washington, D.C., it's very possible that the brown could have helped mask any mud or dirt that she would have gotten on her dress. You can see that it is a little bit more simple in design, and that's strictly because it's an everyday wear afternoon dress. Moving on, of course, but I will answer more questions about objects if you have them. Feel free to put those in the Q&A section. But moving right along, our next Gilded Age gal is Lucretia Rudolph Garfield, affectionately known as Crete. I love her name. She was born near Garrettsville, Ohio, and she was remembered historically for being a highly educated woman and a passionate advocate for gender equality. Growing up in a family that valued both religion and education, Lucretia Rudolph learned the dual responsibilities of farm life as well as household management from an early age. She was described as petite with high cheekbones, dark hair, and dark eyes, and she was recognized for her intelligence, though her reserved and serious demeanor sometimes led others to misinterpret her as cold. Historians attribute this to her upbringing, which we know was loving, but just not outwardly physically affectionate. Crete, as we'll call her love of books was so profound, she even famously stated once that it would be of about as much use to stop breathing as to let books alone if they are anywhere in the region about me. I have to read as I have to live. Her academic journey took her to the Geauga Seminary and later to the newly established Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram, Ohio, now known as Hiram College. It was here that she became acquainted with James A. Garfield, initially viewing him as an overgrown, uncombed, unwashed boy. Lucretia Rudolph eventually recognized his brilliance, and the two began a courtship that blossomed over the exchange of 1,200 letters. Following their marriage in 1858, the Garfields actually faced numerous personal challenges, particularly during what they referred to as the dark years. James Garfield's legal career and his involvement in the Civil War placed significant strain on their relationship, exasperated by the tragedy of their firstborn child, Eliza Arabella, nicknamed Little Trot, dying in 1863. However, this loss prompted the couple to reconcile and deepen their commitment to one another, as well as to their family. Both devoted to education, they took an active role in their children's academic advancement. Despite her dedication to teaching and her independence as a single woman teacher, prior to being married, Lucretia Rudolph Garfield was ultimately prepared to sacrifice her career for marriage, reflecting these complex dynamics of womanhood in this time. For anyone who's an ex-teacher, this may sound familiar depending on what era in which you were teaching. In American society, there was the expectation that if you were a teacher and a single woman, should you get married, you should be actually giving up that role because as a now married woman who has someone to provide for them, you're actually taking money out of a single woman, a fellow teacher's pocket. So there's this kind of unsaid official rule that you have to give up being a teacher. And so we know Lucretia Garfield really didn't want to, but eventually she would sacrifice her career for marriage and for family. Intellectual at heart, as I'm sure you can probably guess, Lucretia Garfield, like other first ladies, became her husband's largest supporter as well as his political advisor. Her term as First Lady of the United States was extremely short-lived, as she fell gravely ill with malaria in 1881, leading her to take a respite at a seaside resort. until she returned to Washington, D.C. in July of that year at the news that her husband had been shot. President James A. Garfield's assassination attempt resulted in an 80 to 90-day period in which doctors attempted to remove the bullets in hope of saving his life. During this time, his beloved wife, barely recovered herself, attended to him tirelessly, earning her universal admiration and respect. Among the doctors attending to her husband was a Dr. Susan Edson, the Garfield family doctor, and a female surgeon whose homeopathic solutions for the gunshot wound were actually overlooked by the other attending male physicians. Despite the best efforts of all attending doctors, James A. Garfield ultimately died in September of 1881 as a result of an infected bullet wound. When Congress determined the payment for the late president's doctors, they recommended paying all male physicians $10,000 for their service. Dr. Susan Edson was listed as a nurse and was originally paid only $5,000. Although she intended to remain anonymous, Lucretia Garfield, as former First Lady, insisted that all doctors who attended to her late husband be paid equally. And she stated in her letter advocating this that, as far as real service was concerned, that rendered by Dr. Rayburn bore no comparison to Miss Edson's. And it seems to me that only justice that this discrimination not be made. As a result of her efforts in that anonymous letter, Dr. Susan Edson was eventually awarded the proper recognition and equal pay of $10,000 for her service. For the rest of her life, Lucretia Garfield remained dedicated to her husband and his presidential legacy. She later added a wing to their house in Mentor, Ohio, in which she created the first memorial presidential library. Her personal insight and designs for the Garfield Monument in Lakeview Cemetery were adhered to, and she maintained her relations with other First Ladies, often visiting Frances Cleveland and Ida McKinley in the White House before moving to Pasadena, California, where she passed away at the age of 85 in 1918. Now, before I move on to more of her artifacts and images and dresses, I do want to point out at the bottom left, you can see that Lakeside Cemetery monument to President James A. Garfield. And we know, based on blueprints and research with the Garfield Historic Site up in Mentor, that she was instrumental in helping to design this to honor her late husband. So despite those dark years, they really did commit to one another fully. What you see down here in the bottom corner is actually a picture, a scanned copy of the letter that we have in our collection in which she actively advocated for Dr. Susan Edson to be paid equally as a female physician to that of her male peers. It's one of our senior curator's favorite objects. It's one of my favorites as well. Now, moving on to fashion, as I said, if I have it, I will show you it. If I don't, I'll be honest about it. Now, Lucretia Garfield, that you can see, she also embodied, very similar to Lucy Hay. She still has this early Gilded Age fashion style about her, but you can definitely see that she is embracing some of its formality. So in the top right, you can see her beautiful calling card case, which was essential in the Gilded Age. It is a sage green leather with a silver ornamentation, and unfortunately, we don't know exactly what year it was made. In the center, you'll notice a blue velvet bonnet with yellow silk flowers that match, to its right, the velvet blue dress from 1880. In the center, you'll see a James A. Garfield brooch, which is believed to have been worn by Lucretia Garfield following her husband's death. To the far left, you have another formal gown, and this one is a two-piece celery green silk bodice with a cream silk skirt, tassels and lace, and a pin attached at the neck from 1881. So we know that this is during that time that she is First Lady of the United States. And then finally, back to the velvet, you'll see that matching bonnet is a two-piece winter gown. It is a velvet bodice with a floral pattern and silk at the tops of the sleeves and cuffs. And that one is from 1880. So that's right before she is First Lady / when she is getting ready to take on her role as First Lady of the United States. So I'm sure many of you probably don't hear much about Ellen Herndon Arthur. Excuse me. And that's for a lot of different reasons, and it's because, unfortunately, she never enters the White House as First Lady. Ellen Herndon Arthur was born in August of 1837 in Culpeper Courthouse, Virginia. And as I said, she's often overlooked in history despite her significant social role during the Gilded Age. As an only child, she epitomized the traditional expectations of an elite Southern woman, mastering both the domestic arts as well as engaging in lavish entertaining while maintaining a strong commitment to her church. Known for her close bond with her mother, especially being an only child, and her lovely singing voice, she is believed to have befriended former First Lady Dolly Madison when the family first moved to Washington, D.C. in 1842. While in Washington, Ellen Herndon at the time, benefited from her family's wealth and her father's military status, granting her access to many influential circles. After moving to New York City, the family faced tragedy with the death of her father, William Herndon, in 1875. In recognition of his service, the family received several honors, including a public fund and a gold medal from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Following an appropriate mourning period, Ellen Herndon resumed her active social life and met Chester Alan Arthur, a lawyer enchanted by her singing voice. They married in October of 1859 with a lavish reception showcasing the era's opulence. The couple then had 3 children, though their firstborn son tragically passed away before even turning 3 years old. Her family's wealth allowed Chester A. Arthur to ascend within political circles, ultimately leading to his nomination as the GOP vice presidential candidate in 1880, aided by Mrs. Arthur's extensive social network. The couple's social connections are evidenced within her address book, preserved by the Library of Congress, which you will see on the next slide, in which she counted the Vanderbilt, Astor, and Roosevelt families among her friends. Apologies. Unfortunately, Mrs. Arthur's life was marked by personal tragedy as well as illness. The sudden death of her beloved mother in April of 1878 profoundly impacted her, as she traveled alone to retrieve her mother's remains, which contributed to her emotional struggles, especially considering that her own husband, Chester A. Arthur, refused to make the journey with her. By late 1879, historians know that Ellen Arthur was reportedly contemplating separation from her husband. In January 1880, she fell ill with pneumonia and passed away only at the age of 42 years old, just as her husband was beginning to rise in political prominence. Therefore, Ellen Arthur never entered the White House, nor did she live to see her husband become President of the United States, also never having opportunity to officially serve as First Lady of the United States herself. Excuse me. When Chester A. Arthur assumed that presidency following the assassination of James A. Garfield in 1881, the absence of a First Lady was felt keenly by the American public. As the 4th president in U.S. history to enter the White House a widower, President Arthur initially intended to maintain his late wife's memory by preserving her personal space in their former home, just as she'd left it. He also continued to honor her wishes in death, but his own health issues soon prompted a change in his approach to the role of First Lady. With his diagnosis of a potentially fatal kidney disease, Arthur appointed his sister, Mary, also known as Molly, Arthur McElroy, to serve as White House hostess for the social season. Educated at the Emma Willard Seminary in Troy, New York, McElroy was an active member of the public life scene in Albany, New York, where she had chosen to raise her own family. In her new role, she also cared for her niece, Nellie Arthur, while providing a welcoming atmosphere in the White House. The American press closely followed Mary McElroy's activities. She differed from various previous First Ladies, as she did not participate in many, if any, charity events, nor did she seem to sponsor independent causes. Instead, she focused on supporting her brother's administration and navigating to the expectations of her role with tact and unpretentiousness. While she resisted lobbying efforts from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, she later joined the Albany Association opposed to suffrage. Her presence in the White House then was seen as a somewhat comforting transition before the next administration. Following Chester Arthur's death, Mary McElroy continued to care for and raise her niece, and eventually passed away during a visit to Atlantic City, New Jersey, in January 1917 at the age of 76. That being said, Ellen Herndon Arthur's legacy, though not widely recognized, definitely contributed to the foundations of her husband's political journey, as well as showcased the societal norms of her time. As I said, we don't unfortunately have much, if anything, of hers in our collection, and it's even such a treat that the Library of Congress has something of her. So you can see here At the bottom, that is her real address book that she owned throughout her life, especially navigating those social scenes of New York City. If you do get a chance to look closely at this, I highly recommend it. You can look at every single page on the Library of Congress's website. And the page that I've chosen does show that she, in fact, had penned in the Vanderbilt family as a friend. Um, at the top, kind of right, you see this blurry picture of a woman in a black dress. This is said to be one of the only known pictures of Ellen Herndon Arthur. And even then, you can tell the quality is not great. And that is, I believe, that is courtesy of the Library of Congress as well, but there's no date either. If you ever get a chance to go to the Library of Congress and look up Ellen Arthur, pretty much everything comes up is actually about her spouse. And so you won't see a lot. You'll see the standardized portrait that you see at the bottom. You'll see the address book, but unfortunately, that's kind of it. You'll be lucky to find that photo of her that you see with a better quality kind of photo in general. But that being said, you can notice that in that picture, she has a very large bustle. Every dress I've shown you thus far from the Gilded Age has a bustle. This is something that remained a very popular trend until we see Frances Cleveland as First Lady break with that. And then anyone who wears a bustle afterwards is kind of seen as outdated and old. So just keep an eye out for that when I keep going through some of these dresses. Speaking of, moving right into First Lady Cleveland. Frances Folsom Cleveland is the youngest First Lady ever of the United States, and she married Grover Cleveland in 1886, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, changed her life forever. Although her sister-in-law, Rose Cleveland, Grover Cleveland's sister, served as a temporary White House hostess, Frances Cleveland became a media sensation, drawing comparisons actually in history to that of Jackie Kennedy. Born in Buffalo, New York in July of 1864, Frances Folsom was taller than 5'7", according to historians, with black hair, or very dark brown hair, and blue eyes. After losing her father in a tragic and devastating carriage accident at the age of 9, she grew up under the care of her widowed mother and younger sister. Grover Cleveland, in fact, was actually her father's former law partner, and he oversaw the execution of their father's estate, becoming a very significant figure in the Folsom family life. Now, Frances herself began her education at Madame Brecker's French kindergarten and later attended Wells College, where she cultivated interests in photography, botany, astronomy, and political science. She was active in theater and debate, and she even delivered a notable speech on free trade as a member of the Phoenix Society. While many expected Grover Cleveland to propose to Emma Folsom, Frances's mother, it was Frances, just 21, who captured his heart. After a brief engagement and preparation throughout a European trip, the couple married in the Blue Room of the White House, attracting intense media attention. Upon moving into the White House as First Lady, Frances Cleveland, affectionately called Frankie, a nickname that she actually hated, she became an instant celebrity, often mobbed by admirers alike. Similar to future First Lady Jackie Kennedy, Frances Cleveland frequently graced magazine covers, inspiring fashion trends and hairdos alike. Companies often exploited her image to market various products, despite her lack of involvement and actual permission in these endorsements. As First Lady, Frances Cleveland aimed to use her influence to uplift fellow women, initiating Saturday morning meetings at the White House for working class women who couldn't typically visit during the week. She also supported young musicians and sponsored a female violinist to study in Berlin, who later became the first American to win the prestigious Mendelssohn Stipendium. Although she was not a staunch temperance advocate, she herself set an example by declining wine at state dinners, choosing sparkling water instead. She supported the Women's Christian Temperance Union and even helped to establish the Washington Home for Friendless Colored Girls, showcasing her commitment to diversity and higher education for all women. She returned to the White House during Grover Cleveland's second non-consecutive term amid the economic downturn of the 1893 recession, facing public disapproval and even safety concerns due to death threats that she and her husband were receiving. Despite these challenges, she continued to advocate for the causes that she believed in, including expressing support for Princess Kailani of Hawaii against imperialistic tendencies. After her time as First Lady and the loss of their first daughter, Frances Cleveland fell into a deep depression, compounded then by Grover Cleveland's own death 4 years later. She eventually married an art history professor, Thomas Jex Preston Jr., in February of 1913, which was actually celebrated by First Lady Helen Taft at the White House. The couple lived in London until World War I, and Frances continued her advocacy for various causes throughout her life. She made her last public appearance in June of 1946 and passed away in Maryland the following October at the age of 83, becoming the first First Lady in American history to live longer after leaving the White House than any other First Lady, with a remarkable 51 years post-presidency in life. On this slide, you can just see a few examples of some of the work that she did while being First Lady. So I do want to point out that that letter you see is scanned into our collection. It is a handwritten letter from Frances Cleveland to a Mr. Kenneth in 1933. It's handwritten on Westland, Princeton, New Jersey stationery in February of that year. And in response, the letter, this Kenneth had asked for an autograph of the late president, and Frances Cleveland informs him that she'll sell him one from a canceled check for $5, but only if he gives the money to the Fund for the Unemployed. And you can also see that there's an image here of her kind of working the room at one of those Saturday morning meetings, as well as you can see her at her desk, often maintaining a heavy correspondence. So I will say, unfortunately, we don't have a ton of Frances Cleveland dresses in our collection, and the ones that we do have are incredibly delicate, as you will often find with Victorian all the way through 1920s fashion. Those dresses are often very heavy, only compounded then by even heavier beading. And sometimes the silk can shatter, and sometimes those flapper dresses are so delicate that the heavy beading actually pulls on them so much. I do want to point out, though, that you can see in the top right, it's a trading card from 1887 of First Lady Frances Cleveland, and she's noted as the Queen of Hearts. That top left gown that you see, it is a one-piece black velvet evening gown with a fleur-de-lis pin and carnival sequins, which just means that they're multicolored, typically those blue, greens, and yellows, and beads, and then there's an attached piece at the waist. Adorning the dress itself are slash sleeves with green silk inlay from the 1890s. If you look at that side profile, you'll notice that she does not have a bustle. So she actively breaks with that. And in fact, her fashion was targeted by the women's Christian temperance movement when she first entered the White House, because she was the first to show her shoulders with her inauguration gown. So she kind of revolutionized Gilded Age fashion in her era. You'll also notice in the center, that's an image of Frances Folsom Cleveland on her wedding day in 1886, and this image is from the Library of Congress. Very similarly, you also see an 1888 National Democratic Convention program featuring Frances Cleveland, also courtesy of the Library of Congress. That bottom right one is particularly interesting. That's Sparks Perfect Health Liver and Kidney Pills from the 1880s. This is within the Smithsonian Institute, but this just highlights, as I said, there were a lot of beauty products, medical products, even certain hair products, if I haven't said that already, would use Frances Cleveland's likeness, especially with the advancement of technology and picture printing, and they would just slap her on ads and say, oh yeah, she endorsed this, oh yeah, she used this, which we know is wrong, but at the time there were very little to no protections for a First Lady's likeness to be used this way. As I said, most historians say that she is the 1900s, early 1900s Jackie Kennedy of the era. Now, Caroline Harrison, you'll notice throughout her fashion, as I show you pictures, she does have a bustle. And this was unfortunately something that she was attacked for as First Lady. Now, that being said, she is often regarded as one of the most, if not the most, underrated First Lady in American history. Caroline, also known as Carrie, to those who knew her, Scott Harrison's contributions as First Lady are often overlooked. Situated in between Frances Cleveland's two non-consecutive terms as First Lady, Caroline Harrison was regarded as out of date, despite being immensely modern in her thinking and her execution of the role. Born in Oxford, Ohio, into a family committed to equality, Carrie, as we call her, grew up in a very progressive household that supported education for all genders, as well as the abolition of slavery. With her, and this is a direct quote, dancing brown eyes, I love that, and vibrant personality, Carrie captured the attention of the very serious and very shy Benjamin Harrison, who actually transferred all the way up to Miami University to be closer to her. They married in 1853 after her recovery from an unknown illness while working as a music teacher in Kentucky. And the couple moved to Indianapolis, where unfortunately the Civil War would disrupt their personal lives. While Benjamin Harrison gained acclaim in his military and legal careers, Caroline Harrison managed their home, raised their children, and she actively supported local charities. An accomplished pianist and artist, Caroline herself hosted musical gatherings at home and took painting lessons from renowned artist Paul Puchki, later exhibiting her work at the Indiana Exposition. Her charm and openness proved to be invaluable during her husband's political campaigns, and she served as a gracious First Lady after Benjamin Harrison was elected president in 1888, despite losing the overall popular vote. A champion of equality and progress, Caroline Harrison was deeply involved in numerous causes that reflected that modern and progressive upbringing and her own personal modernized thinking. She insisted on the installation of electricity in the White House, demonstrating her commitment to modernization within the modern America world in the Gilded Age. And she personally oversaw the project and lobbied Congress for renovations to the executive mansion, although her ambitious plans were ultimately denied. Despite the setback, she still managed to successfully modernize the kitchen as well as renovate several rooms, enhancing the functionality of the residence itself. Her artistic talents extended to her love of china painting, which she opened to anyone interested by inviting her former teacher, Paul Puchki, to Washington, D.C. She also created an inventory of the White House china, rescuing many pieces from neglect, and designed the china pattern for her own husband's administration, which you can see here on this slide, featuring gold corn husks as a tribute to their Midwest roots. This meticulous record keeping was later expanded by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, ensuring preservation of White House history. An advocate for women's rights, Caroline Harrison also co-founded the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1890, serving as their first president general. This organization played a crucial role in promoting patriotism and historical education, and Caroline Harrison used her position to further the cause of women's involvement in civic life. She also helped to fundraise for Johns Hopkins University's medical school with the stipulation that it now begin admitting women for its programs, paving the way for future generations of female medical professionals. Caroline Harrison's commitment to social causes included supporting education and healthcare for women. She went on to host elegant receptions and joyous gatherings at the White House, using her platform to advocate for issues close to her heart, despite facing many personal tragedies and her own illness. Notably, she introduced the first Christmas tree to the White House and lifted the long-standing ban on dancing, fostering a more inclusive and celebratory atmosphere at the executive mansion. Her dedication to these causes showcased her progressive mindset and left a lasting impact on the role of First Lady, setting a precedent for future generations. If you were curious, unfortunately, Caroline Harrison would become historically the second First Lady of the United States who would die in the White House after a bout with pneumonia, what turned into tuberculosis. She actually died before finishing her term as First Lady of the United States, and their daughter, Mary Harrison McKee, would overtake as hostess of the White House. In this slide, you see there's a picture of her among some DAR women. Unfortunately, we don't know the year, but we can assume that it's right around 1890s when she establishes the Daughters of the American Revolution. As I said, in that bottom center, you can see that gorgeous plate that she designed for the Harrison White House china. To the left, there's a stereo view of actually her redoing, the Blue Room at the White House. As I said, she renovated many of the rooms. And then finally, one of my favorite pieces, to the right, top right, is a picture of a White House orchid that was hand painted by Caroline Harrison. You can see at the bottom right, there's her silhouette and her signature. And she dedicated this painting to the wives, mothers, and daughters of America. She then gifted the painting to a national magazine so that anyone who bought the magazine could have a piece of First Lady's art. Just a bit more about her fashion. As I said, she was often compared to her predecessor and then her successor because Frances Cleveland was so young and she embraced this new fashion. And Caroline Harrison was still actively using the bustle, the bonnets, the fans, you name it. So I do want to point out her framed, and it's framed now, but it is a hand-painted fan of flowers by Caroline Harrison. It is white silk fabric with mother of pearl spokes. There's a white tassel on the end, and featured are large pansies. Specifically, a purple one is kind of grabbing your attention. That's the focal point. There are also rosebuds and various greens. And if you do get a chance to come see the fan, you can actually see her initials in the bottom right between the rust-colored leaves and this fan she painted in the 1880s. At the center top and kind of center, it is a two-piece black silk morning dress with velvet embroidery. This dress we actually know was worn to the funeral of the Secretary of the Navy, um, Benjamin Tracy, and the wife, daughter, and maid. They all actually, unfortunately, died in a fire in their home in Washington, D.C. in 1890. And so she wore this gown to the family's funerals. Um, it is topped with a gold paisley cape with carnival beading. As I said, that's kind of those carnival colors, purples, blues, greens, and golds. And it has a velvet trim with a crimson inner lining. And this is actually an earlier piece. We know this is somewhere between 1860 and 1870. In the far left, you'll also notice Caroline Harrison's two-piece gold and plum paisley dress designed by Catherine Williamson and worn at the reception for President Hayes and Lucy Hayes in Indianapolis. It was given back to the family as a gift in 1879. And then finally, at the bottom right, Caroline Harrison's black velvet handbag with celluloid green latch, a black tassel at the bottom, and a matching black velvet bonnet with silk ribbon and green and black plumes from the 1890s. So, unfortunately, even though she was compared to Frances Cleveland and seen as out of date in her fashion, she really did have a lovely sense of style, one that really embodied some high fashion of the Gilded Age and that last bit of the Victorian era. Moving on to our last First Lady before I close for the evening, Ida Saxton McKinley is kind of considered our hometown hero. Our site encompasses our visitor center, but we also preserve and maintain the childhood home of Ida Saxton McKinley, her ancestral home that her maternal grandparents actually built themselves. So she's kind of our hometown hero. I don't like to be biased, but obviously we do love Ida, as we say. She was born in that house actually in June of 1847, which is now considered the historic Saxton McKinley home in Canton, Ohio. Coming from an affluent family with abolitionist and Union sympathies, Ida Saxton was afforded extensive educational opportunities that were unusual for women of her time. She was influenced by her paternal grandfather as well as her teacher, Betsy Mix Cowles. And because of that, she developed a strong sense of social responsibility and a belief that her privileges should be used for public good. Her intelligence and skills in mathematics and finance really set her apart, leading her to work as a clerk and a cashier in her father's own Stark County Bank, where she would eventually serve as acting manager whenever he was away on other business ventures. The Saxton family, as I'm sure you can probably guess, and many of these families are, they're a little atypical for their era. The Saxton family emphasized education and advancement for women, and Ida was the eldest of three. She attended Brook Hall Seminary in Media, Pennsylvania, alongside her younger sister, Mary. She did have a younger brother, the youngest named George, as well. But that Brook Hall Seminary experience only furthered her understanding of the world and social issues. At the age of 22, she and her sister were gifted a grand tour of Europe, which was typically a journey only afforded to young college-educated men. During their travels, she became acutely aware of the struggles faced often by the working woman, particularly influenced by the plight of Belgian women who often had to handcraft lace in poor conditions. This experience continued to ignite her passion for supporting women's causes. Her life took a significant turn, as I'm sure you can imagine, when she met Union Army Major William McKinley. Their courtship was one founded on mutual respect and intellectual compatibility, with Ida, as we call her, asserting that her decision to marry him was entirely of her own volition. The two wed in January of 1871 and welcomed their first child, Catherine, later known as Katie, on Christmas Day that year. However, their early marriage was marked by tragedy, as Ida herself faced profound losses, including the death of her mother, her grandparents, whom she was very closely with, and then both of her children, including their beloved firstborn daughter, Katie. These events profoundly impacted her health and well-being. Later, in general, leading to onset debilitating seizures, which we now know can be attributed to how much she struggled with her second pregnancy, in which she experienced a severe case of preeclampsia, which, if you research it, can onset convulsions. Um, and we know that her seizures were so sporadic that they cannot be determined as epilepsy, which is a modern diagnosis. Now, despite these challenges, Ida McKinley remained a steadfast political confidant to her husband as he rose through the ranks of public service, even participating in his presidential campaigns. As First Lady of the United States, Ida Saxton McKinley emerged as a pioneer advocate for the women's rights movement, becoming the first First Lady ever in American history to publicly support women's suffrage before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Influenced by her early experiences, including her education and her exposure to progressive ideals, she recognized the importance of women having a voice in the political sphere. Through her interactions with suffragettes like Susan B. Anthony, she utilized her platform to raise awareness and mobilize support for the suffrage movement, demonstrating her commitment to equality for all. In addition to her advocacy for suffrage, she was also deeply committed to social welfare initiatives. She supported the Crittenden House, which provided assistance to homeless and unemployed women, reflecting her belief in the importance of community support and compassion for those in need. Her involvement with the American branch of the Salvation Army further exemplified her dedication to those social causes as she worked to uplift marginalized populations and improve their living conditions. Known for her hand-crocheted bedroom slippers, Ida McKinley contributed her artistic talents to fundraisers, using her skills to aid those in need. These small acts of kindness resonated deeply within her community and personal circles, establishing her as a compassionate figure dedicated to helping others. Her influence extended beyond the domestic sphere as she advocated for the appointment of a woman to the American delegation at the Paris Exposition, thus recognizing the need for female representation on an international and global stage. Despite health challenges that sometimes confined her to a rocking chair, or even sometimes we speculated to a wheelchair, Ida McKinley remained actively engaged in public life, showcasing her resilience and unwavering commitment to advocacy efforts. Tragically, her life took a devastating turn when her husband, President William McKinley, was assassinated in 1901. Deeply affected by this loss, Ida McKinley returned to Canton, Ohio, where she entered a period of mourning typical of the Gilded Age Victorian era. Though she would eventually resume her public activities, she passed away just months before the dedication of the McKinley Memorial Mausoleum in May of 1907, leaving behind a legacy of strength and commitment to women's rights, while also being misrepresented in American history as an invalid. So a few things of note on this slide I'd like to draw your attention to. At the bottom left, you see a newspaper clipping, and this is actual proof that we know she met with Susan B. Anthony while she was First Lady. She met with her in D.C., and unfortunately, she was so unwell that she couldn't attend the actual meeting. But we know that she actually contributed some of those crochet slippers to various suffrage movements and fundraisers. The top left is a handwritten letter from Ida McKinley to a Miss Barr. It was written by Mrs. McKinley's personal secretary on personal mourning stationery. The letter to Miss, as she's known, Minnie Barr, is thanking her for a Christmas gift of case and notes. And in her letter, she actually says how hard this time of year is for her. And we know that because Katie McKinley, they're kind of the apple of their eye, that eldest child, we know that because she was born on Christmas Day and unfortunately died in 1875, we know that Christmas was a very difficult time for her. Because we also know that following her death, Ida McKinley entered a large period of mourning and what we would call melancholia, which is our modern day kind of depression. So unfortunately, Ida McKinley's life is just very tumultuous, and yet she still remains very gracious. In the middle center, you see that is actually a pair of those two hand crocheted bedroom slippers made by Ida McKinley. Those are in our permanent collection. They are stunning. They are in wonderful condition. If you look, you can see that she even actually stitched in a little leather bottom so that you weren't slipping around as much in your home. She was very conscientious in her slipper creation. They're beautiful, and you find baby slippers, baby booties, adult slippers. She crocheted over 3,000 in her lifetime. There's also an Ida McKinley campaign button we believe Ida McKinley was one of the first ladies to really actively participate in the campaign trail, something that would later be furthered by individuals like Florence Harding. And then in the center, I also want to draw your attention to that beautiful photo um, of William and Ida McKinley in the Sierra Mountain Range. And this is for their 10-year anniversary in 1881. So, despite public media saying that she was a permanent invalid, we have evidential proof that she wasn't. Despite that muscle weakness and those seizures that she endured, she very much was still a well functioning individual who was unfortunately misrepresented, as I said, historically. As I'm sure you can imagine, her fashion also highlights a very elite Gilded Age style. And you can see, like Frances Cleveland, she too has parted with the bustle. It is no longer in vogue. It is not something that you'll see again for a very long time. But to the far right, you'll see an Ida McKinley three-piece navy blue silk dress with a lace crewel work at the collar and cut steel beading on the bodice and collar itself. We know she wore this in 1900 to 1901. In the center, you'll see another pair of those crocheted bedroom slippers. These belonged to, or were supposed to belong to an infant. They were made by Ida McKinley as a gift to the branch, and unfortunately, the spelling is not great and the handwriting is not great. It's either Branch or Brouch Evans for their newborn child. According to the notes that came with it. Unfortunately, the baby was born stillborn in 1898 and unfortunately never had the opportunity to wear those beautifully handcrafted crocheted slippers. Those just came to us this summer from a Cleveland family who found it in grandma's cedar chest while cleaning out her house. The center bottom is interesting. It doesn't look like much, but this is in fact Ida McKinley's inaugural dress collar from 1897 from the first inauguration. The dress itself is we don't entirely know what happened to, but we know that of the Gilded Age, collars like this could have been placed on various dresses. And we know she used her inauguration gowns multiple times. And then finally, you'll also see that we've started to part ways with the bonnet as headgear. Ida McKinley's hat kind of signifies that shift in Gilded Age fashion. It is a black velvet toque, as it was called, with a silver silk ribbon and white tip silvered plumes from the year 1900. So the Gilded Age, as you can see, whether you're talking about politics, labor, fashion, culture, the Gilded Age was a time of great change. This rapid industrialization, economic inequality, and these evolving roles for women in society, and especially the evolving role of the First Lady. The First Ladies of this era reflect these transformations, each shaping and responding to the challenges of their time. And just to kind of recap, we have Lucy Hayes, who set a moral example, often championing temperance and social welfare while rejecting the extravagance of the era. Lucretia Garfield embodied the rise of educated women, advocating for gender equality even in the face of personal tragedy. Ellen Arthur represented the influence of elite social circles, though she never lived to see her husband's presidency. Frances Cleveland herself was kind of considered to be one of America's first media sensations, using her celebrity then to connect with working women and promote higher education. Caroline Harrison, as I said, underrated, embraced modernization, bringing electricity to the White House while also championing women's professional opportunities. And then finally, Ida McKinley, who defied expectations, supporting women's suffrage and working class causes despite her own personal health challenges. And as a closing note, I'm going to stop sharing really quick so you all can see me. Together, these first ladies reveal how women in the Gilded Age navigated societal constraints, they shaped public life, and they laid the groundwork for future reform movements that you see often in the progressive era. Though some embraced traditional roles while others pushed boundaries, each first lady in this era left a lasting legacy that not only speaks to the complexities of power, but as well as their influence and progress during this very pivotal and impactful period in American history. The Gilded Age may have been defined by wealth and sometimes corruption as we remember it, but these women prove that leadership isn't always gilded. It is often found in resilience, advocacy, and quiet but powerful change. So thank you for letting me speak with you this evening. And I know I can go a bit fast, so I'm happy to bring up my slideshow if you'd like to see something again. But thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Stephanie, thank you so much for such a passionate and wonderful program. You already have compliments in our
Thank you.
chat for such a wonderful program. we definitely have some questions. If you guys have any questions, feel free to chuck those in the Q&A and we can take them. Very first question that came in right at the tippity top of your program is how tall was Lucy?
That's a wonderful question. And unfortunately, I don't fully know. So I don't want to give you something that I don't know. We know that Lucretia Garfield was especially short, and James A. Garfield was over 6 feet tall. She was probably about 5'4" or 5'5". That being said, when we dress mannequins for Lucy Hayes, we're not really lifting her up like crazy like we do for Eleanor Roosevelt, Melania Trump, Michelle Obama. So she's probably somewhere, guesstimate, again, this is not confirmed. We estimate probably somewhere between 5'4" and 5'6", which was
Gotcha.
pretty much the average women's height at the time.
Hmm.
That's a good
Uh,
question.
yeah, it was my eyebrow lifter. I thought I was like, what a fun question.
Yeah,
Did Francis Cleveland have Secret Service the whole time, or did they not have Secret Service back then?
they did. It was very different then. We know that Secret Service as presidential companionship really began in earnest after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln.
Hmm.
So, interestingly enough, when she first entered the White House, based on the research that I've conducted, she didn't originally have Secret Service until she started getting mobbed by people. At one point, there, as I said, there was a death threat, and you'll see it with Jackie Kennedy too. There's this fascination with children in the White House. And we know that the press actively crossed the White House lawn to get to where Frances Cleveland was sitting with her young children and tried to kind of invade that privacy. So eventually she would get Secret Service later, but not right when she first entered as
Hmm.
First Lady. In fact, unless it was during the social season, she actually lived in a separate property because of how much media attention she was getting and the lack
Hmm.
of privacy she and Grover Cleveland were experiencing. Good question.
Stephanie, do you have a favorite First Lady? And if so, who is it and why?
That's like asking to pick your favorite star in the sky. And it's tough because I'm sure you probably can all tell. I love what I do here and I love that I get to talk about all these women. I joke around and I tell people I could probably tell you my least favorite. And that's only because she banned dancing in the White House, and that's Sarah Polk. But she was very
Why did she
impactful
ban
historically.
dancing in the White House?
Well, she was a big temperance advocate as well.
Ah.
Very, she's in that era, in the antebellum era, where it's very traditional roles for a woman. Temperance is just becoming an ongoing movement, and coming from a very religious upbringing, we know Sarah Polk really wanted to promote temperance in the White House, and as a result, dancing can be seen as sinful. And she was so religious that she banned dancing at the White House, and it wasn't until Caroline Harrison lifted that ban that you see dancing happening again in the White House. So I joke around that she's my least favorite because she banned dancing, but I'm just kidding. I don't have a favorite. Growing up, it was Eleanor Roosevelt. I loved her. I loved that era. Into my adulthood, I've really come to admire Mary Lincoln. I think she's historically misunderstood. And then as an Ohioan who's born and bred here, I'm very, very partial to our Ohio First Ladies. I think they're
Hmm.
vastly interesting women, often kind of overlooked in American history.
Hmm.
So it's a really long-winded way of saying I don't have a favorite.
Well,
It's kind of like us.
now I have to ask a really weird follow-up question, and it's I don't know if you'll have the answer, but since you work in a museum about the first ladies, what is the dancing the weirdest White House ban in history? Is there another weird one? Like now I'm so curious. That's the
Hmm.
rabbit hole I want to fall into. Or what are the other like weird like rules or laws that different presidents or first ladies have enacted for the White House?
That's a really great question. And there's a lot of weird things that have happened in the White House based on what first ladies are doing. For example, Caroline Harrison, when she wanted to kind of renovate the space, she wanted an East and a West wing, and they denied her. And now we have an East and a West wing. You have the ban on dancing, a ban on alcohol
Hmm.
during Lucy Hayes's time as First Lady. And then, for example, weirdly enough, you have James Buchanan, who's the first and only bachelor president who didn't even have a First Lady until his niece stepped in the role, Harriet Lane, as his hostess. So, especially in the early eras of American history, because unfortunately mortality rates are so much higher, you have a lot of women who don't enter the White House or who die in the White House or who never see the White House, and their daughter or niece takes on that role. And that can be a little weird to interpret historically because you say Ellen Arthur's the first lady, kind of, but so is Mary McElroy. It's the same thing with Rose Cleveland and Frances Cleveland. Regarding bans and weird things happening in the White House, though, I'm sure there's many things that have happened that we as the American public will never know about.
Okay, we are a little over our time, and I know it's late. I have two silly questions for you that I'm very well. One's a silly question, and then I have two kind of serious questions. If we can wrap with those, if you don't mind. My
Absolutely.
silly question is, I don't know if this is silly, but we've had in recent history, we've had two women run for the presidency.
Hmm.
Had they gotten it, would their first man or whatever that would have been called, would they have entered your museum?
That's a wonderful question. And actually, it got brought up when Hillary Clinton ran for president of the United States, and it came up again this fall. We had a lot of people saying, like, so how are you going to cover this? Are you going to talk about Melania Trump's, similar to Francis Cleveland, non-consecutive second term? How are you going to talk about Doug Emhoff if Kamala Harris wins? So it was definitely interesting discussions. You have to say, like, is he the second gentleman? Is it the first spouse? And someone asked once, are you going to change your name? And actually, a lot of experts, like Anita McBride and some of the folks at White House Historical Association, we all sat on this big call, and they made a really good point that the pendulum, regardless of the era, always swings back. So yes, we would honor a first spouse, a first gentleman, assuming that one day there is a first gentleman, or even with a same-sex couple, we would still
Hmm.
welcome that first spouse.
Yeah.
That being said, when that time comes, we will adhere to how the administration calls that term and determines their role, and similar to like what White House Historical Association does. So we kind of will follow their lead when that
Hmm.
time, should it happen, does. That's a really good question. And it's not silly because we got it pretty much the whole month of October all the way through the end of November. Uh, and if you're interested in more of our programming, I can't recommend joining some of our virtual programs that we do as well.
Wonderful. Yeah,
Um,
please. I'm glad, you mentioned that. I think that's something that we forget to bring up with our museums that spend their time with us is a lot of them offer virtual programming. So please, if you found any of this interested, and yeah, Stephanie just shared their website right there in the chat, um, to please, please, please go and learn more about these wonderful museums, and patron them. They're wonderful organizations that help us stay educated and informed, just like your library does. And then my final two questions, Stephanie, one just from a historical standpoint, and we kind of just talked about it, right? In terms of uh, you might have had to change the name of your museum, maybe. Had we gotten a first spouse, what was that going to look like? It's almost happened twice now. Um, how have you, as a historian, and I'm about to ask you a really big question that I'm going to be like, truncate it. But how, as a historian, has the role of the First Lady changed from Martha Washington all the way to Melania Trump?
I think that's a great, I think that's a wonderful question. It's something that we regularly talk at the site. If you have never heard of them, East Wing Magazine is the only magazine in the world dedicated to the East Wing. So it's everything happening in the First Lady's realm and sphere. And so, should there have been a first gentleman, it would have also covered the first spouse. Um, it has evolved immensely. Actually, our next exhibit, which opens May of this year, is titled The Eras Exhibit. It's a celebration of America 250, where we talk about every era of American history, their pop culture influence, and then specifically, where are the women? What are the first ladies doing? And what is the average woman doing in that era? So it's going to be a really full scope one. I can't recommend it enough. It'll run for 2 years, all the way through 2026, as a celebration of America 250. And in that exhibit, actually, it's a great question. We talk about how, for example, individuals like Martha Washington, Dolly Madison, they're very much this hostess kind of soft diplomat. They're using what we call a soft diplomacy, um, dinners, luncheons, teas, that kind of thing. And they're typically regulated to that of what the typical women role is, which is housewife, family maker, homemaker themselves. It kind of starts to evolve, we say, with in right around this era actually, where women first ladies are starting to champion individual causes, and they are taking on a more public facing role. We know that a lot of this changes, especially with Florence Harding, where she really modernizes the role. It gets then further modernized by, for example, Jacqueline Kennedy, who actually makes up her own cause, restoring the White House, which was a very unique happenstance. And then you have it continuing all throughout the end of that millennium. And then you see it further evolve with individuals like Laura Bush and Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, Jill Biden, Melania Trump. And what's interesting about Melania Trump, actually, and East Wing Magazine's doing a program for us this summer about it virtually. Do follow us. She's going to be talking about how her term differed from the first to the second. And then specifically, is she now breaking a standard by doing what she does or what she doesn't do? Are we so to this point of societal expectations that a first lady has to have a cause and we demonize her if she doesn't? It's going to be a really interesting perspective from a journalist viewpoint about how media talks about first ladies and womanhood overall. So that's a really long-winded answer of saying that it has evolved pretty much as the eras in the American story have themselves also evolved.
I have to point this out. You've had several patrons say I have to have you back, so
I'd be
you'll be
honored.
please anytime. Also, I just because I do love this story. We don't have to talk about. We don't have time to talk about it. But somebody did point out about Edith Wilson, who
Absolutely.
served as the president, which I think is
Yes.
one of my favorite things. Um, so final question I want to wrap up with here, Stephanie. You have been studying history your career. You are in a job that you are very passionate about. What takeaway, and I'll truncate this because again, there's so many first ladies of our Gilded Age first ladies. How has their stories and their legacies inspired you or affected the way that you interact with the world today?
Wonderful question, actually. And the Gilded Age progressive era are actually my areas of expertise. Within women's history, I often say that my areas of expertise, and I don't have a PhD, I have my master's, and I've just gotten a lot of on the ground experience that I'm so fortunate to have gotten. But I often say 1840s, 1850s to about 1940s, because there's so much happening in the beginnings of the women's suffrage movement, especially. And then you see it really come to fruition during the second wave of feminism later in post war America, which is very cool. But regardless, I think, as you can probably see from my shirt, it says, "Don't make me repeat myself," and it's from history. I wouldn't say that history repeats itself. I think that it's more nuanced than that. And I would say that history has a tendency to pattern itself. I think when we are talking about tariffs and immigration, and you see labor union movements happening, especially like last summer with Starbucks and everyone unionizing and Amazon unionizing and UPS unionizing, I often tell people I think that from a historical perspective, I personally feel, and this maybe not the institutions feel, personally feel that I we are experiencing a renewed Gilded Age. There is so much happening politically at the global level. You know, the legacies of imperialism that we see in the Gilded Age, this civilizing mission to the Philippines and to Hawaii, those things have lasting legacies. And some of those things actually set up precedents that went on set World War One, World War II, Vietnam War, and even the war in Iraq. So I think the biggest takeaway of these first ladies is that recognizing how much societal constraints are actually being put upon them. The expectations to still be a housewife and a mother and be quiet in their leadership. And yet, still, these first ladies are only a small sampling of women who are actively challenging that status quo so that people could have the right to choose if they want to be a housewife or if they want to be a political activist. So I think in general that this era sets the groundwork for so much that comes in the decades afterwards. Long-winded again, I apologize.
No, you're
This
totally
is my
fine.
jam.
Thank you for taking so much extra of your time,
Totally.
especially because it's so late where you are. Um, And thank you everyone for sticking with us a little extra longer. Stephanie, I think I will get run out of here tarred and feathered if I don't have you back. So
I'd love it.
we will absolutely have you back in the future to share more stories. You actually like little teaser to my patrons. Stephanie said something that's going to show up consistently next year for me and some of my programming, and that is the 250th birthday of America. So just something to keep in mind that you'll be seeing next year. I want to again thank you so much, and thank you guys for joining us this evening. If you have been enjoying Night with the Museum and you want more of it, don't worry, we're continuing on the third Thursday, not Thursday, it's Tuesday, third Tuesday of the month from 7 to 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. Next month's museum will be the Museum of the American Cocktail,
Ooh.
kind of in honor of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the publication of The Great Gatsby, kind of talking about that era of prohibition and how the American cocktail developed through that. We're really excited there. I believe it's our executive director is speaking for that, and she's very excited to be speaking with us and speaking for you. So make sure you join us for that. And for there is a handout that Stephanie provided that you guys will be getting in an email in the next 2-ish minutes. So
Only if you want it. It's just a summary, a little bit of what I've talked about this evening because it's so complex. And I've also put my email in the chat if you have further questions or I can assist you in research.
from all of us here at the Schomburg Library, Stephanie,